There is a book on my desk that I have opened to the same page 3 times this week. Not the first page, the last. The book is called Belén, Caballo de Troya 12, published in June of 2023. The final volume of a saga that one man began writing in 1984 and spent the next 4 decades of his life completing. 12 books, 40 years, and a claim that most people filed under interesting fiction and moved on. The page I keep returning to is the last one. And on that last page, in an edition I have handled until the spine is soft, J.J. Benítez wrote 2 sentences that have not left me since I first read them. Se me encomendó entregar un mensaje y así lo he hecho. Lo conté todo. I was entrusted to deliver a message, and I have done so. I told it all. Not, I have completed the series. Not, I am proud of the work. Not even, I hope it helped someone. I was entrusted to deliver a message. A man does not use that language to describe a novel. My name is Nathan, former high school history teacher, Evansville, Indiana. 12 years at a Catholic school. World history, early Christianity. 2 decades of independent research after I resigned. I found Benítez's work through a colleague in 2009 and have been reading him, with help, ever since. But I want to tell you something before we go anywhere else. The first Caballo de Troya did not arrive to me through a bookshop or a library. It arrived through my father. He put the paperback in my hands when I was 17. He had found it at a second-hand shop in Indianapolis. A Spanish-language edition with an English description he had read standing in the aisle. He handed it to me that evening and said, "Only, read this. It will not hurt you to question." He was a man of deep Catholic faith who was not afraid of hard questions. I think that was what he wanted to show me, that the faith and the questioning were not enemies. I spent that summer reading Caballo de Troya 1 with a Spanish-English dictionary on the table beside me. My father died in 2021, 2 years before the 12th book was published. He never read the ending. I received Belén as a gift from a reader who knew the connection. A few weeks after it was released, I sat down with it on a Tuesday evening and read until the final page. When I reached those 2 sentences, I sat in this chair, in this room, for a long time without moving. I thought about calling someone. I thought about writing. In the end, I did neither. I just sat there holding the book and understood for the first time that Benítez had been writing a letter all along. Not to his publisher, not to literary critics, not to the church that had largely ignored him, to the people who had been listening for 40 years. And somewhere in the arithmetic of grief and time, I understood that my father, who never knew the ending, had handed me the first page of that letter when I was 17 years old. You were 12, maybe 14. The priest was reading from Matthew, chapter 5, maybe. The Beatitudes, the blessings you were supposed to feel lucky to receive. You were sitting in the pew the way you sat every week. Correctly, quietly, doing the thing that was expected of you. And something did not fit. Not a heresy. Nothing dramatic, just a sense, faint below the level of thought, that what you were being given was not the whole thing, that the version of Jesus standing behind the altar, framed in gold and stained light, was a version someone had built for a reason, that the real shape of the man was not there, that if you could somehow reach behind the icon, behind the approved portrait, you would find something the portrait was designed to cover. You could not name it. You were 14. You filed the feeling under doubt and left it there. Most people leave it there. They grow up, they stop attending, or they keep attending and stop noticing. And the feeling becomes background noise, the low hum of an unanswered question, carried so long it is indistinguishable from the silence around it. JJJ. Benítez did not leave it there. He spent 40 years finding out what that feeling was pointing at. In 1984, Benítez published the first volume of Caballo de Troya. The premise of the saga, stated early and never fully retracted, a researcher is given access, not symbolic, not inspirational, but operational access, to documentation about the life of Jesus that the public record does not contain. Documentation of a quality and specificity that allows a reconstruction of the historical Jesus at a level of physical and temporal detail no academic source can approach. For decades, the comfortable response was to call this a novelist's framing, a marketing device, the apparatus of claimed revelation that genre fiction uses to establish authority. You read it, you enjoyed it, you moved on. Then Benítez published the 12th book, and then he gave the interviews. In June of 2023, in a conversation published by Infobay, he was asked directly about the nature of his books, about the label. His answer, and I want you to listen to the specific words, not the paraphrase, was this: "There are things that are convenient to soften by calling them fiction so as not to wound the sensitivity of many people." Read that again. Not, "It is fiction." Not, "I use fiction as a frame." There are things that are convenient to soften by calling them fiction. The label is a protective measure, not a description of the content, a protection for the reader who cannot yet receive the content in its direct form. This is what he said, in those words, on the record, in the year he completed the saga. Think about that for a second. 40 years of books, 12 volumes, a readership of millions across dozens of countries. And at the end, the author says, the word fiction on the cover was not an accurate description. It was a kindness, a buffer between the material and the people who needed to approach it slowly. Now consider what he described inside those books. The physical Jesus, not the emaciated, suffering figure that hung in every church you ever entered. Not the pallid, bloodless icon through which the institutional church channeled 20 centuries of guilt. Benítez describes, based on what he calls his documentation, a man who stood 1.81 meters tall. Athletic build. No trace of excess weight. Hands that were fine and elongated, precise hands. The hands of someone accustomed to working with detail and intention. 1.81 meters. That is 5'11". In 1st century Judea, that is a physically exceptional man. Taller than the average Roman soldier. Taller than most of his contemporaries. Not fragile. Not defeated. A body that matched what the Gospels actually describe when they describe a man who drove merchants from the temple with a whip and walked through crowds that were trying to seize him. The version you were given in church was not this man. The version you were given was built for a purpose, and the purpose was not historical accuracy. Benítez did not arrive at his conclusions alone. The academic literature, operating by entirely different methods from entirely different starting points, kept arriving at the same station. Bart Ehrman is a New Testament scholar at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He was a committed evangelical Christian who studied at Moody Bible Institute and Wheaton College before pursuing his doctorate at Princeton Theological Seminary. He is now probably the most widely read popular academic critic of the canonical New Testament in the English-speaking world. In Misquoting Jesus, published by Harper San Francisco in 2005, Ehrman documents what he calls the textual instability of the New Testament. His central finding: the surviving manuscripts of the Gospels contain approximately 400,000 variants, places where the text differs from other manuscripts, some trivial, some doctrinally significant. The documents Christians treat as the authoritative Word of God were copied by hand over centuries by scribes who made errors and on occasion made deliberate changes. This is not a fringe position. It is the scholarly consensus. The Gospels we have are not the Gospels that were written. They are approximations, filtered through centuries of transmission, subject to the decisions and the agendas of people whose names we do not know. Elaine Pagels, professor of religion at Princeton University, published the Gnostic Gospels in 1979. Her subject? The cache of early Christian documents discovered at Nag Hammadi in Egypt in 1945. 52 texts, Gospels, epistles, theological treatises, from communities of 1st and 2nd century Christians whose understanding of Jesus was radically different from the version that survived. These communities were suppressed. Their texts were declared heretical. Their leaders were excommunicated or worse. And the version of Christianity that remained was the one controlled by a hierarchical institutional structure that had something specific to protect. Pagels wrote, "The Gnostic texts tell us that the official church selected those texts that supported its own institutional structure, while it suppressed those that spoke of a more direct, personal access to God." Personal access to God, without an institution between you and the source. Now, Ehrman and Pagels are rigorous academic scholars operating within the strict standards of peer-reviewed historical research. They do not claim to have access to hidden documentation. They do not use the word entrusted. They document what the surviving record shows, with appropriate scholarly caution about what it cannot show. Benítez operates in a different category. He does not operate within academic verification standards. I have said that before, and I will keep saying it, because it is true and it matters. But what I have spent years sitting with is this. 2 roads. Entirely different methods. Academic history on one side, claimed direct access on the other. Same destination. The canonical Gospels are not reliable historical documents. The institutional church built its power on a version of Jesus it deliberately constructed. The real Jesus was physically powerful, intellectually sophisticated, and delivered a message that the institution that claimed his name proceeded to systematically replace. Ehrman gets there through manuscripts. Pagels gets there through the texts the church buried. Benítez gets there through whatever he has access to that he will not name in full. 3 different roads, one word for where they end up. And that word is not faith as the church defined it. That word, the one Benítez saves for the end, the one I keep finding in the interviews, the one that threads through all 12 books, is something else entirely. We will get to it. But first, listen to how Benítez describes Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John directly, not obliquely, not through implication. In a published interview, he calls the canonical Gospels a disaster, poorly told, mutilated, manipulated. Those are his exact words. A disaster, poorly told, mutilated, manipulated. And he adds, logically, someone should have told the truth. He is saying that he did. If you ever picked up one of the Caballo de Troya books, any of them in any language, and felt something you did not expect to feel, if you felt, this is real, this is the Jesus I was always looking for, this is the version I always knew had to exist somewhere, you were not being naive, you were not being credulous, you were not falling for a well-crafted fiction, you were not projecting what you wanted to find onto a skilled storyteller who knew how to make things feel true. You were recognizing something. Recognition is not the same as belief. It does not require you to suspend critical judgment. It does not ask you to ignore the methodological questions about how Benítez got his information. Recognition is what happens when you encounter, for the first time in explicit form, something you already knew at a level below articulation. Something you felt at 14 in the pew when the priest was reading from Matthew and something did not fit and you could not name it and you filed it under doubt and left it there. The version of Jesus you were given was too small. Not wrong in every detail, but compressed, flattened, reduced to the dimensions that served an institutional purpose. Guilt as the engine of return, suffering as the mechanism of grace, Obedience as the form devotion was required to take. The Jesus in those 12 books is not small. He is 1.81 meters tall and radiates a physical authority that the icon in the church was specifically designed to replace. He has fine hands and elongated fingers and looks at people, according to Benítez's accounts, with a directness that most people find difficult to hold. He does not traffic in guilt. He does not leverage suffering. He does not require an institution to mediate between the human soul and whatever is on the other side of existence. If you felt recognition reading those books, that sensation was not imagination. That was the most accurate part of you, responding to something real. Here is what Benítez says the message was. Not guilt, not sin, not the elaborate machinery of transgression and atonement that the institutional church assembled in the first 4 centuries of the Common Era and has maintained through every iteration of Western Christianity since. The message was hope. His word. His characterization, stated directly in interviews when the saga was complete. That was the true message of the Master, hope. I want to be precise about what he means by this, because hope in the church's vocabulary means something specific, and it is not what Benítez is describing. The church's hope is conditional. It is earned. It is the hope of the compliant. The hope that if you follow the rules, fulfill the obligations, confess the failures, submit to the hierarchy, you will eventually arrive somewhere better than where you are now. It is hope with a contract attached. The contract requires an institution to administer it. The hope Benítez documents across 12 volumes is structurally different. It is not earned. It is not conditional. It does not require an institutional intermediary. In Caballo de Troya, there are passages, and I will not cite exact page numbers because my translation is imperfect, and I do not want to put false specificity on something this important. There are passages where Jesus is shown to explicitly and directly refuse the logic of institutional mediation. He is shown, in accounts of specific conversations with specific individuals, to describe a relationship between the human soul and the Father that requires nothing between them. No priest, no bishop, no structure of ecclesiastical authority, no designated channel through which grace is permitted to flow. The temple, in Benítez's accounts, is not the place where God lives. It is the place where access to God has been bureaucratized. And Jesus, in these accounts, is specifically deliberately dismantling the bureaucracy. Vermes, the Oxford historian who spent his career recovering the historical Jesus from beneath the theological construction, wrote in Jesus the Jew, published by Collins in 1973, that the Jesus of history was not operating against Judaism. He was operating within the prophetic tradition of Judaism that had always been in tension with the priestly tradition. The prophet spoke of direct relationship. The priests administered mediation. Jesus, Vermes argues, was a prophet in the lineage of the prophets. Benítez would agree with the conclusion from a different starting point. The message was direct relationship. The message was that the architecture of guilt the institution built, the sin transgression atonement engine that required the institution to function, was not what the man originally described. The message, stated simply, was, you do not need anyone standing between you and whatever is on the other side. The message was hope, not the hope that is earned, the hope that is already there. Benítez published the final book in June of 2023. The Vatican said nothing. I want you to sit with that. Not a condemnation, not a correction, not an official statement from any dicastery or commission or spokesperson. Not a quiet, scholarly refutation published in a Catholic journal. Not even an acknowledgement that the books existed in any official capacity. Nothing. The institution that burned books in 13 and 14 and 1500. The institution that tried Galileo in 1633. the institution that placed Spinoza's work on the Index of Forbidden Books in 1677, the institution that condemned Teilhard de Chardin's writings in 1962. That institution, which has a long and documented history of responding to perceived threats to doctrinal stability, looked at a 12-volume investigation into the historical Jesus that sold millions of copies across dozens of countries in multiple translations and produced no official response. I have checked. I have asked people who track Vatican communications more carefully than I do. There is no official condemnation of Caballo de Troya. There is no official acknowledgement. There is no document from any Vatican office addressing Benítez's claims directly. There is silence. Now here is what I learned in 12 years of teaching history to 16-year-olds who thought silence was neutral. Silence is never neutral. Silence in institutional history is a strategy. It is a calculation. It is a decision made by people who understand exactly what they are doing. Condemnation draws attention, a formal refutation, a doctrinal correction, an official statement. Any of these does two things the institution does not want. It amplifies the work being condemned, because nothing sells a book like being condemned by the church. And it opens the institution to a documented public debate it has no guarantee of winning. The church looked at Benítez's final declaration. I was entrusted to deliver a message, and I have done so, and made a decision. The decision was not to engage, not because the books are trivial, because the books are not trivial. A scholar I respect, who prefers not to be named in this context, put it to me simply, the church does not respond to things it cannot afford to have debated. 40 years, 12 books, millions of readers. A final declaration that the work was not fiction, but a delivered message, and an institution with 20 centuries of experience managing inconvenient truths chose to respond with the one tool that leaves the least trace. Silence. The same silence that surrounded the discovery of the Nag Hammadi texts for 12 years after 1945. The same silence that surrounded the Dead Sea Scrolls while they were held by a small group of scholars for 40 years before full publication in the early 1990s. The same silence. I'll let you sit with that. He left you a letter. You just did not know it was addressed to you. 40 years. 12 books. A man who said he was entrusted to deliver something and spent 4 decades doing it. A man who called the canonical Gospels a disaster and said that logically someone should have told the truth, and then said, at the end, quietly, in 2 sentences on the last page, that he had done exactly that. The letter is not addressed to scholars. It is not addressed to theologians or academic critics or Vatican officials who chose not to read it. It is addressed to you, to the person who was 14 and sitting in a pew and felt something not fit and could not name it and left the feeling there for years. To the person who picked up one of those 12 books at some point, borrowed, purchased, found in translation, and felt, unexpectedly, something that was not quite like reading a novel. Something more like recognition. Something like, this is the version I was looking for. This is the shape I always knew had to be there. The message inside the letter was not guilt. It was not the carefully maintained weight that the institutional church placed on the concept of sin and constructed into an entire architecture of spiritual debt. It was not conditional hope, the hope that waits for compliance, that requires the right forms of submission, that is administered by a hierarchy that benefits from the administration. The message was the other kind, the kind that does not require a contract, the kind that does not need an institution to unlock it, the kind that was there before the canon was assembled, before the councils voted, before the 4 Gospels were selected from a larger library of texts, and the rest were burned or hidden or left to decompose in the desert heat. Benítez spent 40 years delivering it. He said so himself at the end, in 2 sentences that I have read 3 times this week, on the last page of the last book. I was entrusted to deliver a message, and I have done so. I told it all. The message was hope. Not the hope the institution sells. The original kind. The kind a man who stood 1.81 meters tall and had fine hands and elongated fingers and looked at people with a directness that most people found difficult to hold. The kind that man described in Benítez's accounts to the people who came to him in the early morning and the late evening and asked the question that no institution had ever answered honestly. Is there actually reason to hope? The answer, across 12 books and 40 years, was yes. Not a theological argument, not a conditional promise requiring an intermediary, a letter. You have it now. This is Nathan, Forbidden Gospels.